Good to see you all. Welcome to the Mythbusting panel. I'm excited to moderate this discussion. As Jeanette said, a lot of the work that I do is about futures design, and you can't design a future without a shared vision. So a lot of the work that I'm privileged to do involves bringing stakeholders together, oftentimes people who are not necessarily speaking to each other on a regular basis, but helping them to speak a common language and decide what their shared objectives could look like and ultimately what the future is that they're hoping to design. So I know this is happening before lunch. I hope this works up an appetite for collaboration. Promise I'm not going to be that cheesy on this panel. But I'll introduce you to our panelists and then we'll jump in. So first we have Eric Davis, who's a section manager at Con Ed's Research and Development Department, where he helps his colleagues overcome challenges by implementing innovative technical solutions. So over his 9 years at Con Edison, he also held roles across energy efficiency, demand management, regulatory, program design, and program operations. And then prior to joining Con Ed, Eric co-founded NREL, an energy policy data and analytics company based in New York City. Eric started his career in the mining industry and has a Bachelor of Science degree in Mining and Minerals Engineering from Virginia Tech and an MBA from NYU. Hello, Eric. Dr. Brett Branco is a marine scientist at CUNY's Brooklyn College and the executive director of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. His research interests range broadly from water quality in urban estuaries and lakes to coastal climate adaptation. Since arriving at Brooklyn College in 2009, he has successfully built partnerships between communities, researchers, and government to develop deeper understanding of the issues facing coastal communities and ecosystems in New York and the range of options to address them. So Dr. Branco earned his PhD in oceanography at the University of Connecticut, in addition to holding a position as Associate Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Dr. Branco has served as co-chair of the Water Quality Group for the NYNJ Harbor and Estuary Program and is the past president of the New England Estuarine Research Society. All right. Basil, who's right here, Basil Alsubee is a Syrian teacher, writer, and documentary filmmaker, currently serving as a project manager and climate hub advocate at We Stay, Nos Quedamos. He draws from his background in community organizing, urban histography, and environmental justice work between Southeast Michigan and New York to address the intersection of environmental justice and housing justice in the South Bronx. Through the Climate Justice Hub, Basil aims to put together a hyperlocal South Bronx environmental justice and housing justice youth organizing curriculum. In everything he does, Basil hopes to put into practice the potential of coalition building across various histories and geographies. And lastly, we have Michael DiRamio, who co-directs the NYSERDA, which stands for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So he co-directs their policy, strategy, and stakeholder engagement in support of creating clean energy solutions for communities on the front line of climate crisis in the state of New York. He's leading efforts across NYSERDA's portfolio of programs to collaborate with environmental justice and low-income communities and ensure equitable benefits from investments in building decarbonization, transportation electrification, distributed and large-scale renewable energy, clean energy finance, climate technology, innovation and research, and workforce and economic development. All right, so lots of different perspectives on stage. We'll get started with just kind of a level-setting question for those of you who might not be as familiar with characteristics that go into successful pilot projects. I'll invite any of the panelists to just chime in on what qualifies as a successful pilot project. Why does this topic matter?
I guess I can start with that one. So in my role in research and development at Con Edison, we do a lot of pilots. And we do those pilots because, especially in the energy and clean tech climate space, things that you're introducing into that system will affect the system, its customers, everyone who operates and engineers the system. So you can't introduce things without thinking through the impacts of those introductions. So there are various risks involved in doing that work. So you have an idea, hypothesis that, okay, I will implement this widget or this piece of equipment or this program, and it will have net positive benefits to society, to the system, to to the operators, et cetera. So our role in Con Edison and in other organizations such as NYSERDA and beyond, our role is to understand those potentially beneficial things and de-risk them prior to introducing them at scale. That's the whole idea. Not only the energy system, but other systems. You need to de-risk things before you scale them. Understand the impacts and potential positive benefits of those technologies before you scale them, because if you don't test them out, your hypothesis could be wrong, and you could negatively impact people, customers, and have negative financial outcomes, things like that. So our whole role is to de-risk and then deploy. So attributes of successful pilots are, we identified all the risks, we spoke to the customers who would be impacted by those systems and got their feedback and involved them in the process. And then we tested those hypotheses. We de-risked those identified risks, maybe identified some new ones that we didn't think about. And then once that's all understood, we can then more safely and at a lower risk introduce those improvements to the system as a whole. That's a general view of kind of how we look at things. We want to identify as much as possible up front, so we're not blindsided by something later before deploying at scale. And we want to, again, always have net benefits to the community that we serve. Hopefully that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. All right, so we have 6 myths that we're gonna cover, and we're gonna try to look at different perspectives as much as possible. For those of you in the audience who can really relate to one or more of these perspectives, I'd welcome you during lunch, come up to us, share more of your own perspectives. So we will start with the first myth, which is really about looking at pilots overall and the idea that they can be expensive, risky, and take too long to deploy. So the question that I have for our panelists today is, if each of you can just share an example, give us a story about your experience with pilot projects that were well executed, and just give the audience a sense of how were you able to demonstrate the value or the efficiency for pilot projects that were successful. And you can share from your current experience or a past one.
I can get us started. Hey, everybody. My name is Basil. I'm at a South Bronx-based community-based organization called Nos Quedamos. We do work at the intersection of housing and environmental justice. And I'll keep it brief, but I just want to talk about the project we're currently working on that brings me to this room in front of all of you. And that project is the Resilience Hub project. It's a project where we are constructing what essentially looks like 3, casitas, or like small little houses with solar panels, battery storage for the solar energy, rainwater harvesting, and Wi-Fi and like a space inside to basically just gather. And these are being constructed in 3 community gardens in the South Bronx, which, if you know anything about community gardens, you know that they are run by people who are extremely passionate, who bring their own traditions and histories to the work. In the South Bronx, community gardens emerge in a context where the Bronx was burned throughout the 1970s at the hands of real estate companies and landlords. And so a lot of these plots of, essentially, burnt down land, burnt down buildings, were repurposed by community members to become sources for healing, for growing food, for food sovereignty, for allowing, folks who don't have access to food to be able to get it at a cheaper price. And so, we're supporting these gardens, which are at risk at being, sold and developed, in a city with a tremendous housing crisis. And we're constructing these hubs. And what the processes look like, it's been like a decade-long process, to be, clear, of just like revisiting, planning, and piloting. And I think right now we're in the piloting phase, where we have done several meetings with community gardeners and also with the green architecture firm Pavilion in South Brooklyn, which is constructing the hubs, where we have essentially gone over like what are the benefits, what are the risks, what are the concerns that you all have, and how would you like to see this run and operate into the future. And we did a whole educational series with like mostly working class people on solar energy and all of the different green jobs workforce, all the kinds of like things, ideas for programming and things that'll come with the hubs. And that's been mostly a successful process with some hiccups and issues, which I'll probably get into more later. But I would say contra the myth, pilots are the way to ensure that you don't have to deal with unnecessary expenses that come up through failure, that you actually have to deal with the risks before you scale your project, and that the length actually saves you time because it saves you the time of having to deal with all the different hiccups and issues that emerge when you scale a project. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, sure. I'll go next. So I'm here today actually representing a project called FloodNet, which is a collaboration between CUNY, NYU, and the mayor's office. I see Paul here in the audience, who's part of our team. So I'll talk briefly about that project and its origins. So the origins. So basically, what FloodNet is we are building and deploying extremely low-cost ultrasonic sensors to detect flooding on the streets of New York City. And then, of course, developing all the associated firmware applications. We have a very robust community engagement strategy, which I'm sure we'll get into later about that. But the project really started independently at NYU and CUNY for different reasons, actually, altogether. From the CUNY side, because I was more involved in that, it emerged from years of engaging with communities around Jamaica Bay, with the frequent sunny day flooding that they were experiencing and the coastal flooding. We had a project called Flood Watch where community members were taking photographs of flooding as it occurred, and we were trying to make that more visible to city agencies and researchers, and connecting communities with resources. And the idea of a flood sensor was to supplement the human part of taking a photograph. We wanted to be able to collect data independently of an individual having to worry about the flooding that's happening and take a photo and upload it. So that's how we started working on flood sensors in collaboration with communities. And then the NYU team was focused more on stormwater flooding as they were developing their flood sensors. It was actually the mayor's office that put us together to start collaborating. But before that, we were doing a lot with very little money. So pilots don't have to be expensive, especially in academic settings. You'd be amazed at what you can do at CUNY with $40,000. But we were able to advance this work quite far with seed funding from CUNY, seed funding from NYU. The mayor's office helped us get a little bit of state funding for a data dashboard. So we were able to do quite a bit on the cheap, and deploy these sensors in communities that we had pre-existing long-term relationships with, which made the deployments. It simplified the whole process of deploying the sensors in the right place. The communities already had buy-in, et cetera. So from our perspective, the piloting phase, it was not expensive. It didn't take a long time, and the risk the risk we can talk about the risk later, but that's my perspective on a pilot project.
Can you hear me okay? All right. So for those that aren't very familiar, NYSERDA acts on behalf of the state to deploy the state's resources for clean energy. So that's research, development. It's not in our name, but a lot of what we do these days is demonstrations and deployment. I think there's going to be more conversation later today of one of the projects that I'm more loosely connected to. I'll just briefly note that I think speaks to the importance of pilots as a way to ensure that this, a clean energy transition is really inclusive. We can't wait until we got it all figured out to bring in those communities that are most impacted today, that are most vulnerable today to the burdens from our current energy system. So in my view, pilots are necessary and to ensure that we're going to have benefits and not increase the burdens to those communities. So one project I'll mention is partnering with NYCHA, the Public Housing Authority here in New York City, where there's the real challenges for costs for going from fossil-based heating systems to clean electric heat pumps. And so we worked very closely to say, how can we do this in a way that isn't going to displace people from where they're living, that is lower cost, and the technology just wasn't really there. The manufacturers weren't here for that. So, in that project, I wouldn't say the too long part. Sometimes it does take a long time, and my point with the too long is to say we need to start now to do it right. So it might take some time, which is why we're starting early in the process. But we've partnered with some manufacturers that have developed new products to actually serve high-rise affordable housing with units that you can just swap out like an air conditioner in the building. So that takes time, though. If you're a manufacturer, you need to be developing new products. Like there needs to be incentive. There needs to be a sense of scale, which NYCHA brings. So that's one example. A lot of work that I was involved in that was related to that around heat pumps beyond public housing. We were looking at just how we can electrify heating across the state, including in New York City, and realized we really needed to do research around that. We needed to understand the building stock. We needed to really understand what households would be put at risk potentially, switching from, for example, fossil gas-based heating systems in particular, but also oil heating and propane and other sources to heat pumps. And that work really paid off. We did some early, just with a few hundred homes, and we're now, with the federal dollars coming down, the first out the gate of all the states to deploy the federal home energy rebates as a result, because we've done that work, right? And so we have a better sense of where there is a no regrets approach where we know homes are going to benefit from these technologies. We still have a lot more work to do to protect those households as we do this, especially fossil gas households. But I think all of this I think it was mentioned earlier, I really appreciated the focus on learning. We're all learning here. Nobody's got it figured out. We certainly don't have it figured out. And I think that's why it's so important. Pilots are so important for everybody to learn and collectively.
I'll just add a little bit on top of that. When this myth on pilots are expensive, risky, and take too long to deploy, I just say it depends. If I want to put a sensor on our electric gas or steam system, maybe we can do it in a couple months, wrap up the pilot in a year, and move on to scale or shut the project down or whatever. It really depends on how many stakeholders are in the process or affected by what you're trying to deploy. So if it's more of a community-centric thing that's going to be on a customer's property or facility, whatever it may be, that has many more stakeholders potentially involved. So you need to consider those stakeholders, and that takes time and money, and there's more risk involved. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. So preparation up front can help, depending on how you define start and end to the pilot, can dispel this myth a little bit. If you come in prepared with all the things, great. You can kind of move efficiently and effectively. But if you're figuring it out as you're kind of building the plane while you're flying it, that can lead to kind of longer, more expensive pilots. So it really depends on what you're trying to do, how organized you are when you're doing it, and then executing. It really all depends too. So this myth isn't fully dispelled. Like sometimes it can be expensive and risky and take too long, but some doesn't always have to.
Thank you for that. All right, we're going to move on to myth number 2. So the second one is really speaking to this idea that as you're convening stakeholders, they're all starting from the same point of understanding. So I want to break that down a little bit, and I think what would be helpful is maybe let's talk about ways that we can bridge that knowledge gap. And I think particularly, Brett, I'd love to start with you on this one. Just can you share just ways that we could better educate stakeholders, just meet them where they are as they come into these piloting processes?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really important part of the entire FloodNet project. So maybe let me make a couple of points about this. I think the first thing is to really understand, to bridge that gap. Who asked for the technology in the first place? Who asked for the innovation? Was it the city? Was it a community? Was it just an idea that you came up with that you think fills a need, and now you're out there trying to sell it? You have to understand who asked for it. Hopefully someone asked for it, right? But then you have to make sure that all the stakeholders that you're committed to serve. So on the FloodNet project, our stakeholders are communities and community residents. It's also city agencies. It's also the research community. It's also the private sector. There's a demand for our data from all of those sectors, but they weren't all there in the room when the technology was asked for. So we have a lot of work to do, right, to make sure that we're aligned with the needs of all those stakeholders. And I want to zero in on the communities for a moment. So the communities that we had longstanding relationships with embraced the idea of flood sensor deployments. However, new technologies like that or deployment of solutions like that need to be placed in context with the community. It's not, and what I mean by that is it is our responsibility to do the homework and have the conversations with the community to understand how this project fits in with a long history of trying to address needs that the community has been trying to address for a long time, right? Because if you come in with a pilot idea, a new technology, a community is going to say, this is great, but we've been asking for X, Y, and Z for 20 years, and now you're coming up with A, right? Now we're back to A, and we would like to know how this fits in, right, with all the things that we've been trying to do and the things that we've been asking for. And that's your responsibility to go in and learn that from the communities, putting your project in context. And that requires a lot of time and effort. So then I want to get to the second part, which is, a lot of teams end up creating, hiring people to lead community engagement efforts, right? But it is not their responsibility alone on the team to do this kind of work, right? Everyone on your team has to be committed to understanding what the community needs are, learning from the community engagement team. We do a lot of research about communities that have nothing to do with flooding. We go in and we try to understand what each and every community, what's important to them, housing, transportation, other things. And I just wanted to acknowledge, by the way, Sophia, who's sitting here at the front table, who's part of our community engagement staff, who does a lot of that work, right? But when we send a group of sensor engineers out in the field to install sensors, we want them to read this background material. We want them to understand the neighborhood that they're in, employing technology, because invariably they're going to be approached by residents. They're going to be asked questions about what's happening, and they need to be able to respond in a way that is sensitive to the community, et cetera, right? So this is a super important part of sort of getting everyone on the same page. I could talk a long time about working with city agencies as well, but I really want to focus on the community, because I think that part is oftentimes underfunded in these types of projects. And not everyone on the team, I think, feels responsibility for that deep understanding of the communities that they're trying to work with. So I'll leave it at that.
That's helpful. You want to chime in?
Yeah, I would just want to say a couple things. I mean, endorse and echo everything that Brett shared, and I would just say that, and I'll say more about this in the next question, but what has been helpful for us is literally putting the means of producing knowledge in the hands of community. So what I mean by that is giving community the ability to do their own research, their own community planning, and not being patronizing about how we go about sharing knowledge, and treating community members like they're experts, and not in a way that's like, what's the word? Like tokenizing, but in a way that is material and genuine and sincere, and actually genuinely listening. Because sometimes we feel like we tick the box of hiring the community person, and then the community person gets yelled at, and then the community person comes back, and then, okay, cool, we're gonna ignore everything that the people said when they yelled at you, and then I'm gonna send you to another community to get yelled at again. And it's this thankless process that does nothing for anyone, you know, except get feelings hurt. And I think, you know, we have to start, besides hiring community people, all go out to our communities, all talk to our neighbors, and also genuinely take the tools out of the academy, put them in the hands of seniors, put them in the hands of young people, tell them that you could do a lot with this that would shape the direction of the project and the future of your community. And that's what we try to do through our partnership with CUNY and the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. We're working on a organizing curriculum around housing justice and environmental justice that the youth is eventually going to teach. So I'll share more about this later, but I just think it's, you know, instructive for us to think in that way.
Awesome. All right, let's move on to myth number 3. So this one is really just thinking about the incentives that people have, the motives that they're coming into these conversations with. And so the idea here is that there are conflicting priorities as people get together and try to get on the same page about what this pilot can produce. So I think I'll start with you, Michael. The question is, how can we bring together these diverse interests and use that to form a shared objective? How do you build consensus? How do you get everybody on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think, again, I'm going to keep harkening back to the previous panel, which I thought was great, just of the orientation to relationship building versus transaction. So important. You know, if we're in this for the long haul and we're not just talking about a project or time horizon of a year or 2 years, we're talking 10 years, 20, 30, and repairing a lot of relationships in many cases, right? Including between government and community, between utility and community, between you know, companies and government, and et cetera. So, you know, I think it's really important to really come in with that learner's mind, that learner's perspective, that we all have something to learn. I think and the focus on relationship building. So having a long-term view, even if there might be something in our world, there's a lot of pressure at the state level to, you know, achieve this scale point, right? But we need to, before we push to go to scale, we need to make sure that we're going to be going together and with everybody. And because we're going to, you know, the old adage of going slow to go fast, right? Or going together, we're going to go faster and further. And so I think, you know, certainly at NYSERDA, we are really focused on the power and, you know, the privilege that we have and creating space for mending some of these relationships and building more of the trust that's really going to be critical to going together in these directions. And so, you know, I think, you know, we've established, you know, relationships with communities across the state. We have 12 regional clean energy hubs. These are all community-based organizations with their own networks that are working to really, you know, engage communities and build relationships like what I'm talking about. We are working at the state level to try to create more of the table that's compensating community organizations that don't have the resources to be there to participate in these kinds of planning efforts. You know, we are really focused on, I think it was mentioned earlier, of having a vision. You know, what is the vision and what are the priorities that we should be taking on when it comes to historically marginalized communities, overburdened communities, disadvantaged communities? There's lots of terms out there. But at the end of the day, you know, people's lived experiences, how are we going to be shifting from that? And then not looking at, like I think we're saying here, that the state is got an agenda, or utilities have an agenda, or you know, companies have an agenda. Everybody has interests, right? So how are we looking at this collectively and creating spaces that are safe for and hopefully dealing with the power dynamics, because we know those exist, right? Including with us at NYSERDA. So we have a neutral third party helping to facilitate this, that is sort of takes, we sort of try to step back a bit, right? Create the space. So all of these kinds of efforts are an intention to recognize that doing things the way we've always done will just result in the same system that we have. So if we're going to be thinking different, getting to different results, which are, community-based, more of the kind of nature that Basil was just speaking about, empowering communities or really self-determination around what the energy system and what the benefits will come from that. We need to be thinking beyond, a particular sector. We need to be thinking about how we can create cross-sector partnerships that recognize that it isn't a level playing field. So we do need to compensate for some stakeholders to be there. We do need to have dedicated forums for those voices to be heard, and not be drowned out by those that have more of the resources, et cetera. So all of these are principles, if you will, that we're trying to put into place, and that we're trying to given the resources that we have, create the space for the centering of climate equity in our planning work, which is, we don't turn on a dime even ourselves, right? So we're trying to do that work internally as well at NYSERDA. We're trying to support that with other agency partners, because we know a lot of the issues are not just energy issues. They're, like it was talked about, they're education issues, it's transportation issues, they're human service issues, et cetera. So I think it's really creating a table where we can have that shared vision with principles that we can all agree to, and with a dynamic that allows for equity to be centered.
Yeah, please.
Yes, I've been contemplating this myth during that. And one thing I want to say is that, from our experience in FloodNet, all the stakeholders that we work with at a very high level have the same priority, and that is to improve human well-being in the face of climate hazards. I think that's true. I think that's true of city agencies. I think that's true of researchers, certainly true of the communities. And I think it's true of the private sector. Where conflicts arise is how do you do that, right? How do you do that within the constraints of your institutional structure, and how do you just the process of reaching that shared goal. That's where the conflicts arise. But I think that sometimes it's useful to go back to that very high level priority, right? That we're all trying to improve human well-being. And it allows us to have a conversation, right?
Yeah, definitely. I'm just very quickly. I think I would hone. This is one of the myths that I actually somewhat agree with. But I think it's something that is meant to be navigated in a way that's smart and intentional. And I think the way that we have navigated it, because the community members in Melrose and the South Bronx that we work with, they're no BS, Like, if you're gonna tell me that you have the same interest as me, okay, where's my piece of the pie? Give me ownership over your project. And there are models for doing that today. There are ways to redistribute wealth within projects, and again, give community members ownership over the means of producing. So in the case of energy, you can institute a community land trust structure through which community members are able to actually own the means of producing energy, so that it doesn't go directly, you have a solar developer or offshore wind developer who builds this thing and then expects subscriptions from people who are already overburdened with their energy bill, and have been scammed by renewable, fake companies, and then expect them to just sit idly while the energy is produced over their building and then sold to the utility company and then sold back to them. So there's a way to circumvent this, and that's the community land trust model. And I think that's a way to navigate the conflicting priorities thing in a way that is actually equitable and redistributive.
Thank you for that. All right, let's move on to myth number 4. So the idea, we've been talking quite a bit about this community perspective from both sides, trying to get in, sitting within those communities themselves. So this myth is really just about the idea that perhaps communities resist innovation. And I think what we should chat about is how can we just better address what some of those concerns might be? Is it really resistance, or is there just a deeper concern that we can better foster? Is there a way that we can create more openness to new ideas? So I'll start with you on that, Basil.
Oh my God, I'm so excited to answer this one. This is one of my favorite myths because it is just so abundantly and clearly false to anyone who has ever been a member of a working class community. I think working class communities across the city are among the most innovative. I mean, you are forced to survive in conditions that are literally not meant for human survival. You have to innovate to get by every single day. And so this idea that they resist innovation is silly to me, but that they resist in general is not silly to me. It's very real. Community members have to resist. They have to resist every single day. And in the South Bronx, we're talking about a primarily Latino community. If not an immigrant community, a black community, African community, Bengali community, who like deal with all kinds of issues. This is the poorest district in the wealthiest city in the world, which is utterly shameful, I should say. And they come from displacement back home, and they are currently being displaced by real estate gentrification. And so, and they have all kinds of climate issues back home. Hurricane Maria was not very long ago. And so, for me, the spirit of answering this question is the spirit of, resistance that founded Nos Quedamos in 1992, which was, resisting an urban renewal plan that would have displaced the community. And also more recently, I think the spirit of Andreas Malm, whose very wonderful writings on disruption, sabotage, and the importance of that work in futurism, ultimately, is really ringing in my mind. And I think, we have to be thinking, when we think about these issues, we have to be thinking about rent burden, we have to be thinking about high asthma rates, we have to understand that this is a climate emergency, and it requires radical tactics, and not just, building and growth. Like, it requires both. And there's so much that I can't share in my capacity as a panelist here, and as a worker in a nonprofit, squeaky clean organization. But I think we all wear many hats. There's the hat that you wear when you clock in, there's the hat that you wear when you clock out, and you have to make sure that you're intentional in navigating that when we're trying to do this work, and understand that communities are always innovating, we just don't listen.
For that. Anyone want to chime in a little bit further? Thanks for that.
Yeah, I would just wholeheartedly agree that this is from previous life, but I spent many years working in the city of Detroit. And if you want to find a place where innovation has been essential to just getting by, and I heard you say Southeast Michigan, so we have to talk after. But just at a time where, took an hour and a half for an ambulance to come to people's homes, no street lighting, bankruptcy, all of that. Community groups sprung up to address the gap, right? So innovate, I agree wholeheartedly, and that really colors how I view and think about, okay, so what is the role of government? And I think our role is to, like I mentioned earlier, to create space to shift from a paradigm where community engagement is more, I think the word was token, to where we're up the scale, the spectrum here towards collaboration, and with there are limitations to what we can do as a state government, right? But as close as we can to that self-determination, right? And in my view, in my experience too, that communities aren't resistant to innovation when they're part of the early stages, right? I think the challenges come when we're announcing a big plan and it's all splashy and it's big press release, et cetera, and those communities, it's just human nature, right? You're going to switch into survival response, fight mode. If we want to shift to an environment where we are not in that mode, where it is early stage, where we're just considering ideas, and that's really what we've been trying to do at the state level at NYSERDA, is create those tables where it's very early thinking. What should we be even thinking about? What should we be factoring into our long-term planning? And bring communities along with us. so that it's really they're part of that journey. It's not a destination; it's a journey that we're trying to build here together. And so that's really the fundamentals of that are the transparency. So when what we hear regularly when it comes to just stakeholder fatigue, like you're coming to us and you're asking the same question again. What did you do last time? I think that was brought up earlier too. We need to be transparent and say, look, we know we've heard these issues. This is what we have, what we can do and what we can't do, and here's why. But we want to work on it with you. And so, in my view, that transparency is really critical. We can't be afraid as a government entity to be open about that. We can't be afraid to, just be honest. And so that's a lot of what our team is trying to do, working with our colleagues and others, and and then just being accountable, saying, we know we have a role to play here. Here's, again, what we can and can't do. We're going to work on it. We're going to measure our progress here, like I mentioned, on that spectrum, just when it comes to the engagement work, but also when it comes to the benefits and the burdens. Where are we going? What are we doing? We're going to be having dashboards that we're producing that's going to chart that and be very open about that as a state, including the city here, the work that's happening here. So, again, I think innovation is not a scary word. I think, people use different terms. Being creative, having grit and determination is really what a lot of people in communities, I think, see it as. But it is innovation, right? If you're able to take a very limited resources and do a lot with it, that's innovation. And so I think we are. I think at NYSERDA, we're working to really recognize that if we can build the capacity of communities to take what they have and have the support from an entity with technical support that they might need, but to create those kinds of solutions, then we're going to have many more benefits from these kinds of investments than just, a dollar went here and look, this thing is built, but the community hasn't seen real benefit from it. So I think that resistance fades away when it's done early, when there's openness and transparency.
Thank you for that. All right. We're going to move on to the fifth myth, which I think, Eric, this is your chance. We're going to talk about big utility. I think more specific to those who are looking to partner and understand the inner workings of these organizations. The myth here is really that big utility is resistant to this conversation on energy efficiency and all the ways that we can get there. So, Eric, I think just starting with you, what would you advise that we start to think about in building more effective collaboration? How do we build a productive partnership with utilities?
All right, yes, happy to kick this off. And just generally, if you want to learn more afterwards, come up to me. My colleague Watson is out in the crowd too. We can connect offline or in person and further discuss the intricacies of the utility behemoth, not only locally but statewide, because we are heavily regulated by the Public Service Commission, which is a statewide entity that allows us to collect money from everybody to then redeploy it for beneficial programs such as energy efficiency. And one key aspect to that design, slightly technical here, is we have what's called a revenue decoupling mechanism, which separates our financial incentives from the energy you use on a day-to-day basis, the electricity you use. So we predict how much you're going to use in the future. We collect money to pay for all of that. And whether you use more or less, it all comes out. We either give money back or we collect a little bit more in the future. So we are neutral on how much energy we use, and that allows us to have programs such as energy efficiency to encourage you to use less. So that's like a baseline policy structure that allows us to operate neutrally in that space. But also, we are actually financially incentivized to have energy efficiency programs. If we successfully deploy capital to customers for energy efficiency projects, at scale, if we meet and exceed the goals that the state has set for us, we can be financially rewarded for that in the future. So we're actually aligned with these programs. Our motivations are clear financially to implement these programs, and that's statewide. All the utilities in New York State are very well set up to support customers in this process. So we are not resistant at all. What we care about is like the aggregate peak usage. Like if everyone's turning on their air conditioners at 6 to 8 p.m., like we start to care about that because that reaches the limits of our equipment. So that's when we have to install more in the system, and we do earn on those investments generally over time to cover the costs of them. But otherwise, day-to-day use, we are neutral, actually positive in terms of reducing the energy use from customers. So that's like the baseline. So we are here to help. We have hundreds of people, many, many hundreds of millions of dollars to give back out to communities to do this work. So we are on everyone's side here.
Any added perspectives? Thank you for that, Eric.
Oh, and so is NYSERDA. NYSERDA is in this game too. We collect money from everybody for these programs. We also collect money for NYSERDA to then deploy out in these programs. So we're all on the same team. It's having that long-term perspective and understanding the basics of it. This comes back to education. We're out in the communities trying to educate people. We might not use the term revenue decoupling mechanism, but we are out town halls in the community trying to help people understand that we have these programs. If you want to do this project, if you happen to own your assets, for example, your home, there's money out there for you to improve and make your energy cleaner, more resilient on your own system while we're working on ours.
Yeah, I'll just agree. A lot of what we do in working with our colleagues at DPS, who also oversee the resources that we get from them. We get resources from other sources too, but I think the conversation is always who's best equipped to play a certain role, and a lot of so we have a joint management committee, for example, it's called, but just partnership with the utilities, with NYSERDA around all the low-income programs. And so it's, okay, what should NYSERDA manage and what does it make sense for, given our resources, what maybe makes sense for the utilities to manage, given their situation and their resources and their expertise. And, I think, it goes beyond that. At NYSERDA, we're obviously focused, like I mentioned, on research and development as well. And so certainly in this conversation of piloting, we have a lot of resources, a lot of technical capacity, analytical abilities, et cetera, that can complement the deployment work, which when I read this to me feels like deployment. Implementing measures is going in people's homes and going in buildings and going on site and incentivizing projects to be developed at scale. Often, we need to be piloting work. We need to be making sure that those incentives, those measures are optimized, right? The resources that everybody's on their bill, like was mentioned, are paying into, that we're being good fiscal stewards of. We're being responsible with the resources that we're given. So we have these obligations, right, and these responsibilities. At the same time, we have these goals, these very ambitious goals, right, to achieve our climate neutrality, and to do that in a way that's responsible and doesn't put, like I mentioned earlier, particularly those households that are vulnerable to, see increased costs on their energy bill. How do we do this in a responsible way? And again, don't wait until the end. Don't wait to get it all right with those that have the resources. So all these things, I think, come together, and I think we need to be doing, I would say, more even than we are at the state level, to be collaborating with our partners and working with our utility partners to, ensure that we're doing this transition responsibly and meeting our obligations, but doing it creatively as well. And innovation is a key part of that.
Awesome. All right. We're going to get to the final myth, which really speaks more from a local government perspective, the idea that policymakers don't listen to stakeholder input. So let's break that down a little bit, I think, just to wrap up today's discussion. And this is open to anyone who wants to chime in, but the idea here is, how do we work with local government? How do we navigate these challenges to just facilitate what we're all trying to achieve here, which is ultimately a successful pilot project?
Mind if I take this? Can I be honest? This is more often true than it is not. Organizations and communities have been leading all kinds of plans and initiatives to decarbonize that are extremely thought through, that have taken years of study, research, and it's when we get to the finish line of just sign the piece of paper, endorse the, package the policy, get it through the door so that we could start getting to work and, getting money into community members for all kinds of stuff between green workforce development and training, renewable energy projects, making polluters pay for the pollution, all kinds of shutting down certain fossil fuel emitting infrastructure like peaker plants, which if anyone here is in NYPA, I have a million questions for you about that. But, and none of it seems to go through despite all of the work, the action, the blood, sweat, and tears that community members are putting in the face of elected officials who, proclaim their allegiance to working class people and to climate justice. But the more time goes on and the worse the climate emergency gets, the more this allegiance really starts to feel like an insult. And the more angry people are really starting to get, frankly. And I think there's just so much to be done and so little that is happening. And including rolling back, congestion pricing is a huge question mark right now in New York. And a lot of people are wondering why the governors, we know the reason, but it would be great to hear honest words from policymakers from time to time around why they support or don't support things that seem to go with their purported, agenda. When policymakers are on our side, that tends to be the exception to the rule. So, hopefully that changes.
Yeah, this one's difficult. I'm not a policymaker, but I've worked with them quite a bit in the past, and we have to ask permission to collect money for every investment that we make as a utility. Sometimes it can take 3, 6, 9 years, if not longer, to get approval from that policymaker to do a certain, what we think is a beneficial thing. And it's not that the policymakers aren't listening, but those initiatives cost money, which raises bills, raises taxes, whatever, things have to be funded. And politically, that can be challenging if they're up for re-election or this. They have a lot of things going on. They don't want to increase costs to customers. So they have to balance a lot of things. And unfortunately, some climate things may not make it to the top of their list all the time. I think things are hopefully changing and things are starting to get implemented and we're making progress, but it's taken a long time to get here. Yes, it should move faster. It's not like they're not listening. Yeah, they might be listening, but are they acting quick enough? Probably not. So I don't envy the policymakers because they have a difficult role because every decision they make affects our wallets, our life, our well-being, everything. So I guess it's a partial myth to me.
Yeah, can you hear me? Is it working? Okay. Sorry. I think there's different, I have mixed feelings about this because I wholeheartedly agree with everything that everybody on said in response to this. And I am operating within that system, right? And yep. And so, you do the best you can from where you are, right? And what you can control. And then there's things outside of your control that you try to leave at work when you go home. But I would say, and there's different levels too, right? There's different kinds of policymakers. Technically, I'm considered a policymaker of some kind, even though I'm not making laws. I'm not the ones making all the decisions on a lot of stuff. So, there's within agencies, there's policymakers of a sort, right? That are making decisions that are listening, I would say. And that certainly I've seen, and we are working to, like I mentioned, through all these different ways I mentioned earlier, to have things documented, to be accountable, to elevate. I mentioned the regional clean energy hubs. Each of them is developing an assessment right now of what are the barriers, what are the opportunities, and we're paying for that as a state. It's going to be documented. We're going to be summarizing it. We're going to be reporting out on it. So there's ways to hold policymakers accountable, and I think that is in many cases the job of people outside of government to do that, right? We're there to, in our case, to administer programs, not to necessarily create laws, in our case anyway. So I think some of that everybody has a role to play here. And I think the more that you can find allies, I would say, and we look for allies externally too, that it can help, we want to amplify the points they're making, because we see it too, right? So through those reports I just mentioned as a good example, we want to amplify what those community-based organizations and their networks in each of the regions across the state, including 3 here in New York City, are seeing. Where do they see the barriers? Where do they see the opportunities? Okay, let's use that to guide policy. How do we put that policy into practice, though, when you're working with, in our case, I have many colleagues that they're just running and trying to get money out the door, trying to meet certain objectives that they've been tasked with, right? And so these are all human beings. And so I think all of it is just connecting on that level, and then using information to sort of drive awareness. I think one of my goals this year is to get as many of the executive folks at NYSERDA to be in communities, to be hearing directly, because that doesn't happen that often, or often enough, let's say. So again, not a solution. I play my part. Everybody has a part to play. Yeah.
Thank you for that. All right, so I have a couple just rapid fire questions, because we have a couple more minutes to play with, and I'd actually invite all of you to participate in this even from your seats. If you're open to using a notebook or your phone, the questions are for all of us. I want to hold space for the fact that we live in a very polarizing time, and we may not always understand where people are coming from. So it's my biggest hope that we can move past that. And so the question for all of us is, if you had to trade places, or if you could trade places with anyone, any stakeholder group, whether it's some of the ones that we talked about today or others that were not represented in this conversation, and the purpose of you taking on that role would be purely just to learn a day in their life and to gather some perspective from their actual experiences, what role would you choose? And I'll give you a second to write that down, because my hope is that during lunch you can find somebody that is sitting in that role and that can facilitate some conversation. So I'll ask you all, what role would you choose outside of the one that you have now?
Mine would be utilities, and also NYPA. The closest I got, I want to plug this to everybody, is this board game called Energetic by City Atlas, which I would highly recommend. It's like a very fun, creative way to learn, what goes into planners' minds when they're trying to electrify a city like New York.
I guess mine would be going back to policymakers, or local or state policymaker, legislator, commissioner, because I have a sense of what they're going through, but it's only a fraction of what they're actually going through in terms of decision making and the impacts they're making.
I think for me it would be a resident who experiences frequent flooding and just the challenges associated with that.
For me, I'm always humbled by communities and learning from their experience. But I'll couple that and say I've actually had lots of different. I've worked in local, state, federal. I've worked in utilities. But the one that we're talking a lot about today, I haven't, is more in the climate tech company, and what that takes to, take an idea to, I think it was said, it starts as an idea, then it becomes, or starts as an opportunity, becomes an idea, becomes, I think we need more of that, and I think I would really benefit from understanding really what it takes.
Very cool. All right, final question, I promise. But again, inviting you all to participate in this. I think sometimes we underestimate our own capabilities. We each hold superpowers that I believe if we activate them more often, it can probably accelerate the path to the futures that we're trying to design. And so the question is, if you had a superpower that you believe would best help you navigate this very complicated, very urgent crisis that we find ourselves in, what would that superpower be? And I'll invite you guys to answer that.
Mine would be to just magically be able to shut down all fossil fuel infrastructure immediately, and to make sure that I never hear, I think, the worst myth out of all of them that I heard from our governor, unfortunately, which is that kids in the Bronx don't know how to use computers or don't know what a computer is. Yeah.
Yeah, similarly, just snap my fingers and rebuild the grid the way it should be, in terms of clean, resilient, affordable. So having free money to do all that would be nice.
I was thinking it would be to be able to occupy the consciousness of anyone that I choose for a brief moment of time to sort of gain their perspective instantaneously would be my superpower.
Yeah, I hate to double on that with a slight twist, but just back on the previous question, I just feel like so much of the friction that happens is because of it's just ignorance. People just don't know. They don't know what it is to deal with that person's situation or what they're grappling with and everything. And so I would, and this isn't really a superpower. We could do it if we wanted to, right? It's just like a week. Have everybody from these different sectors have it be a requirement. If you're going to work in this industry, you got to spend a week in communities. You got to spend a week in utilities. You got to spend a week. It's like, why aren't we doing that? Why can't we do that? I don't think that would require superpowers, but I think it would help reduce the friction and just open people's understanding of what it will take.
I think mine would be healing for each of us and for the planet that we are so fortunate to occupy. Thank you all very much.